I'm Kayla Martin-Gant. I am the continuing education coordinator for the Mississippi Library Commission. I started literally a year and like 2 weeks ago. I started right before the pandemic, and roughly 2 weeks into my new job there, we had to work from home until June. So it's been a very interesting year, as I'm sure it's been for all of you. Prior to that, I worked at a public library for 6 years. I went in as like a circulation assistant, and then I became the teen librarian for 3 years, and then I moved to reference and genealogy. So I've kind of done like a little bit of everything, but teen services in particular is one place where my heart is always going to be, and that's why just recently, when I was getting my master's of library and information science at the University of Southern Mississippi, for my capstone project, I decided to kind of examine some of the collections in our young adult areas in Mississippi libraries. So that's part of what this is about. So first, I want to kind of talk about the reason why an intersectional collection is so important. Obviously, most of us probably have some answers ready off the top of our heads, but a lot of times, there's kind of a disconnect between how diverse we think our collections are and how diverse and inclusive and intersectional they actually are. So I want to talk about that just a little bit first. So in her 1990 essay, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors, I'm sure you guys have either read that or at least heard about it. Dr. Bishop explains the title, Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors, as a metaphor for how kids see themselves and one another reflected in literature. The thing about diversity in fiction is it does multiple things, right? It provides readers with representation, and they see themselves and their experiences, and that kind of gives them a way to recognize their own identity as one that is valid. Which obviously it is intrinsically, but when you don't see yourself represented in literature or really any media, or the representation that you have is not great, that can really, really affect how you view yourself in the world around you. It also gives readers an inside view into the lives of people with different perspectives and experiences. So the thing about that is that it's not just important for people to be able to see themselves in literature. It's very, very important for them to be able to see other people and just, if nothing else, briefly kind of take a walk in their shoes. Obviously, you're not going to get the whole spectrum of what it's like to be a certain person. But when you do that, when you get insight into other people, it starts to build empathy and understanding. And that's why it's so important for children's literature, especially, to have this diversity and inclusion, and for people to be able to see themselves and to see other people. Because once you start building that empathy and that human connection as children, that is going to stay with you as you grow older. So those are three important aspects of why that is. And the thing is, the sentiment is true not just of singular aspects of identity, but also how multiple identities can impact a person's life, because they can. We all have, multiple interesting things about us. We all have multiple things that mark us as different from the people around us. And the way those all interact gives us a very, very unique perspective and a very unique experience. And when you have multiple marginalized identities, that can really, really affect your worldview, and it affects how other people see you as well. So, there we go. So what is intersectionality? The National LGBT Health Education Center states that it is the idea that comprehensive identities are influenced and shaped by the interconnection of race, class, ethnicity, sexuality and sexual orientation, gender and gender identity, physical disability, national origin, religion, age, and any other social or physical attribute you can think of. Let's see. So why did I want to do this study to begin with? Why did I want to examine these collections? And the collections that I'm specifically referencing are the young adult LGBT collections of Mississippi Public Libraries. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because most people's identities hinge on more than one attribute, and our literature and our collections, consequence of that, often fail to reflect the reality of those lived experiences. There's a certain thing that sometimes we do, and we do it very unintentionally. But when we start to try to collect diverse titles, or when we are confronted with the idea that our collections are not as inclusive as they maybe should be, we say, well, we've got these books, these are, LGBT books, and when we've got books, with people of color as the main characters, and then we've got these books that have, main characters that are disabled or have, learning disabilities or whatever, and it's like, okay, but the thing is there are lots and lots and lots of people that have all of those things happening. It's not just a one singular, you get one singular, marginalized identity and then you're off. Lots of people are dealing with a lot of different things, and we really, really need our collections to reflect that. So this is a quote from Medina. I got this from We Need Diverse Books. Medina is a Honduran-born non-binary adoptee and a writer. They have cerebral palsy and they live in Brooklyn. And this quote really struck me. It says, "How much of myself am I allowed to see in stories? As a person with multiple intersecting identities, how much of myself do I need to see reflected on the page at one time?" A lot of us, for instance, me, I am a queer, neurodivergent, fat woman in the South. So, I've got a lot of things that I'm personally dealing with. I also deal with chronic illness. A lot of us have a little more than that, a little less than that, in terms of things that can really affect, how we move throughout the world. At the same time, I'm white, I'm cisgender. I'm not visibly different from a lot of people around me. And so I have a lot of literature that I've gotten to read as I grew up that really, in a lot of ways, reflected my life. And a lot of us do too. And what I love about this quote is that you realize just how much of that literature really is not that intersectional, and people that have these multiple intersecting identities, they don't see themselves, not accurately. Whereas I may get, a book that like, bam, covers all my bases. There are so many titles that just really don't do the breadth of human experience justice. So a little bit about maintaining diverse collections. Representation in LGBTQ young adult titles, by and large, it really tends to skew toward white, gay, cisgender boys. In recent years, that has started to change, especially in the last couple of years. We're getting a lot more variety in our titles. There's only so much that we can do as librarians, like to impact publishing trends directly. We can, but it's not like we can just march up with a list of demands and be like, y'all fix this. Because if we could, I would have done that a long time ago, and I would probably still be doing it as we speak. But one thing that we can do is to make sure that we are carrying the increasingly diverse titles that do exist. We can supply those books to the people who need them, and we can increase demand that way. So how are we actually doing on that? That's where this study comes in. So what do our collections look like right now? I would like to specify that, yes, this is for public libraries in Mississippi, but especially for other libraries in the states around Mississippi, this is probably at least a little bit indicative of what your collections might look like as well. So just something to keep in mind there. My study title was called No Such Thing as Too Much Diversity. It was a bibliometric collection analysis of LGBTQ young adult titles in 10 Mississippi libraries. And I'm going to briefly kind of talk about how I did the study, and then what the results were, because I want you all to be able to replicate this should you so choose, because this information was incredibly useful. And it's also just in my job as the CE coordinator, it's been extremely valuable because I can see with some of the 10 libraries and library systems rather that I looked over in this study, where some of the gaps in their collections are and how I can help them fill those in. So my purpose statement was to examine the young adult holdings of 10 Mississippi public library systems. I wanted to determine the level of racial diversity in the young adult LGBTQ titles, as well as the representation of sexual orientation and gender spectrums. So basically, I wanted to look at the YA LGBT collections of these libraries and see just how racially diverse they are, and see how many titles were queer books that weren't just, you know, white cisgender gay boys, as I said earlier, because that tends to kind of be the predominant trend. So my methodology first, the way I did the library system collection, I don't know exactly how applicable this will be in surrounding states, but even if yours isn't like set up quite like this, you should be able to adapt this strategy. So our state is, it has 5 public library districts. So I eliminated any library system with a service population that was like under 50,000 people. The only exception to this was the Washington County Library System, which was in the Delta region. It only serves about 44,000 people, but it's the second largest system in the region, and it's like the only other system that came close to that 50,000 mark, other than the largest system, which is the first regional library system, because that one serves over 300,000 people. The Delta is a very kind of rural area, other than like certain pockets. And so the first regional library system tends to cover a lot of bases. So other than those 2 systems, all of the other ones were a little too low. And it's not that I don't want to study all of those other systems as well. It's just that I wanted to look at the ones that had like at least 50,000 people, because I felt that with those service areas, they would have the budget to potentially be a little more representative. So then once I eliminated all those libraries, I randomly selected 2 of the remaining library systems from each district. So I had kind of a stratified and a randomized method of searching for these library systems. This is just a breakdown of the districts. You see this blue right up here is the Delta region I mentioned. And where I work tends to be this little red area right in here. But yeah, this map right here is available on the MLC website. And I imagine y'all kind of have a breakdown available to you as well, where you could do this too. So then my title search procedures. There were 476 unique titles published between 2000 and 2020 that were chosen from the following sources. I went to the Queer Books for Teens database, the Lgbtq Reads blog and database, which that second one is actually like my kind of personal go-to. It's run by Dahlia Adler, who is a young adult author, and not just young adult, but she did recently come out with another young adult book. And that database is extremely thorough, and it's updated very regularly. She's very, very active on Twitter, and she can really, really get you some good recommendations. I also used the YA Pride blog and database and the Rainbow Book Award list. So first, the lists were created. They were titles with either a main character, like not necessarily the protagonist, but a significant main character with a significant role, whose sexual and or romantic orientation was something other than gay or lesbian. Their gender identity was something other than cisgender. Race or ethnicity was something other than white by the general US-centric consensus of the definition, because that's a whole other topic. But how we kind of define whiteness here in the US is often very different than in other areas of the world. or any combination of the above. So then after those lists were created, I made 3 other lists of titles that were like sort of the control comparison groups that were, I made a list that were white characters, gay characters, and lesbian characters. I just used Google Sheets to create spreadsheets for each list. And then that way I could indicate which library system had which books. We have something called the Beehive resource sharing system. It combines like all participating library system catalogs in Mississippi, which most of the public libraries, there are very, very few that don't participate in this. So they were all pretty much covered. It combines all of those system catalogs into a single database that updates in real time. So I used that to search the collections of each of the 10 library systems. And then if there were any that were like kind of confusing or inconclusive, I searched their individual catalogs. I used that, and then I converted all the data to charts to illustrate which systems had the most intersectional young adult LGBT collections, which marginalized groups were most and least frequently represented, and then kind of the overall volume of the LGBTQ titles from the lists I made in each of the systems collection. And an important thing to note, the book lists and the blogs that I pulled from, like for this study, they're not wholly comprehensive. They were influenced by the curators, but they're still pretty thorough. Those are, some extremely detailed databases, and I didn't feel that it was very likely that the number of mistitles would be really like large enough to impact and invalidate the study's results. But I did want to make a note of that. There are a lot of titles that have come out in the last few months in particular that definitely belong on this list. But A, I did this study in December, and B, budgeting and collection development and all of that has been kind of like a little up in the air due to the world like being on fire for the past year. So there are definitely some titles now that I would put on this on all of these lists that aren't on there at the moment, but it should also be noted that there was some overlap on the title list because several of the titles, yay, it's a good thing, had like multiple avenues of intersectionality in their main characters. So while there were 476 unique titles used in the study, each library system had 641 possible match opportunities. I hope that makes sense to everybody, but essentially what it was is like, there was one title that might be on 3 different lists because they featured characters of color as like the main characters, and they had, like differing sexual orientations or gender identities. And so they went on all of those different lists because I didn't want to just be like, this one's going to go on this one particular one, even though it has all of these other things, because that's kind of the point of this whole study. So now we get to the results and what that means. This is where all my fancy pretty charts come in. So this is a whole lot of numbers, but hopefully it's easy for everybody to understand. This is just like the final title numbers for each system, and the books on the list that I created, the number of books that they had. And the column here, like on the far right, is out of how many titles, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But as you can see, the first regional library system had the most out of any library system. But that's also because it serves over 300,000 people. It is a massive library system. It's the biggest one in the entire state. And all of the ones that had like those really high numbers tend to be either library systems that cover a very like large geographic service area, or ones that are like in college towns. And so they have a big like but condensed population. So, and I'm gonna break like all of these numbers down in just a second. So first of all, the number of listed YA titles with Black, Latinx, and Asian or Middle Eastern main characters per library system. I put Asian and Middle Eastern together, not because I view them as, you know, interchangeable, but because they both, those are both like on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of how many books are available. And I wanted to have an even number of books I was searching for to give comparative results. So each of those lists was comprised of 50 titles each. And this chart here, if you can see, it's split into three. So it's like once I mushed all of those together, these results are how many of those titles they actually had like in their systems. So the first regional library system, which is, you know, the big, huge one I talked about, it had the highest number of listed titles, which was 82 out of 150. And then the Washington County Library System had the lowest with 13 out of 150. Again, that's not a knock in any way on the Washington County Library System, because as I mentioned earlier, it's also the smallest one that I was working with. And I'm only pointing that out to you all so you understand when you look at these numbers, how service area affects budget and how budget affects like how you're going to be able to, how many titles you're going to be able to get. And not only that, but when you are a smaller library system and you have, you know, a smaller service area and a smaller budget, you likely also have, you know, a smaller staff, you have less time, and you may have less time to devote to really searching and seeing, you know, what titles you need to be getting. Which is not to say you can't, it's just, you know, that's why I wanted to do this study and that's why I do stuff like this so that I can, you know, help people that don't have time to do this, but still want their collections to be as diverse and inclusive and representative as possible. So this is the number of titles that featured characters of color other than Black, Latinx, or Asian or Middle Eastern. There were very, very few of them. And that's part of why I wanted to show this to you guys. Like it should be really like noted that titles featuring Native, Indigenous, and First Nations people, featuring Romani people and Pacific Islander characters, those that I could find were in like the single digits. And somehow, you know, some of these library systems don't even have some of these books. So at the very least, I wanted to present this chart and be like, y'all could maybe, you know, if nothing else, get these queer books. But I will talk more about the availability of some of these titles later and how that's not necessarily indicative of a problem with libraries and library systems as much as it is an issue in publishing in general. So here were the titles featuring white main characters. This was a list comprised of 100 total titles. So I'm showing you guys this one, and then you're going to see side-by-side comparisons later. And I want to kind of see what you note. Because the thing is in several of these library systems, like the percentage difference of white characters versus characters of color in the LGBTQIA collections seems to be like pretty small. It's not that different. And sometimes it looks like titles featuring the non-white characters actually outnumber the white characters. But the thing you have to remember is A, like people of color aren't a monolith. And in that vein, B, all of those lists that I created for all of the non-white characters were essentially 3 different groups at 50 titles each versus this one with 100 titles. And the reason I did that is because it was easy to find 100 queer YA titles with white main characters, and it was often very difficult to round out a list of non-white characters for whatever race or ethnicity I was looking for, just to 50. So it's still, when you actually look at the numbers in context, the LGBTQIA titles with white characters still like way outweighs anything else. This is the number of listed YA titles with gay, lesbian, and bisexual main characters per library system. All 3 of these lists had 100 titles each. As you can see, there are some variances, like some significant variances per library system. But also like titles featuring cis gay boys are typically found most frequently in each library system when you compare them directly with cisgender, bisexual, and cisgender lesbian characters. There are a couple of exceptions to this. If you look at these numbers, you'll see, but in all 4 of those cases, the number of titles featuring cis gay boys is still significantly higher than the titles with cis lesbian characters. So a lot of the, regardless of what you're looking at, the boys still outweigh the girls in terms of cis characters in representation in these titles. So this is the asexual or aromantic main characters for library system. This list only had like 35 total titles because that's pretty much all I could find at the time, and I searched high and low. I know I missed some, obviously, but there are very few titles for YA that feature asexual or aromantic main characters. And now that is changing as well. There are some that have been published in like the latter half of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 that I'm really, really excited to read. But if you'll notice, like 3 of these library systems didn't have any of these books. Even the library system with the highest number of titles out of just 35, they only had 12. This is one area where we could really, really, it wouldn't be difficult at all to develop more representation of this particular group in our collections. But you have to also remember that these low numbers are potentially due to like a number of factors, including the lack of available titles altogether, and more importantly, the lack of marketing for titles in this category that do exist already, because you don't often hear of the titles with asexual and aromantic main characters, even when they do exist. So that's not just an issue in terms of what's available, but also like they're not really talking about it, which is a problem. And then this is just the general percentages of listed titles per library system according to orientation. So in pretty much all of these cases, the gay boy characters are represented far more than everything else. This chart in particular is so striking to me because when you see all of these numbers side by side, it's really, really kind of baffling how we miss so many of these titles, especially when you look at how low the numbers for asexual and aromantic characters are, and that's out of 35 available titles, compared to how many of the bi, gay, and lesbian character titles that are available. So I just wanted you guys to kind of see the numbers side by side to really, kind of get the gist of it. I promise we'll be done with charts soon, don't worry. So this is the percentage of listed titles with transgender, non-binary, or otherwise like gender diverse characters. And this list is comprised of 50 titles total. Again, First Regional kind of takes first place with everything that's available. The findings regarding these particular numbers visually are like really similar to those of the asexual and aromantic characters, though they are higher all around. I think this is partially due to the fact that there were, 50 listed available titles for this category as opposed to just 35. But it could also potentially signify that more attention is paid in marketing and distribution of these titles, which would make sense given like the current socio-cultural and political climate, especially here in the US and also in the UK, because there's been a steady increase of public discussion on rights and acceptance for trans and gender diverse people in recent years. That conversation hasn't always necessarily been great, but there you have it. Either way, there is a lot of discussion on this topic, and so there has been, I think, more marketing with this particular subset of books. So even the library system, which was first regional, with the highest number of holdings in any of these categories, still only had 50% of the total possible title matches. That is wild to me. It probably shouldn't be, but the largest library system in the state, and it serves over 300,000 people, and it has the highest number in like all categories. It still only got 50% of the total matches. That's a problem. That's not me blaming that library system or any of my Mississippi library systems, because I understand that this is a multi-factor issue. But that's still something that can and should be worked on actively. So where do we go from here? Really quickly, you can discuss like in the chat, and we can talk about it maybe at the end of the presentation. I want you to think about if we are unwittingly engaging in self-censorship. I know, a lot of us wouldn't obviously do it on purpose. And by self-censorship, I mean, are we avoiding ordering certain titles and avoiding, displaying certain titles just because we don't want to face the potential backlash? I know for a fact that is an issue in some of our library systems because they are in extremely conservative areas of an already extremely conservative state, and they are afraid of the potential issues they're going to have, so they're a little wary of ordering those titles. And I just want you guys to think about if maybe you might be doing that as well. Do we lack the knowledge of resources for finding these titles? Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times, and again with this third point, we don't necessarily have the time or the staff to really investigate our collections to see what gaps need filling. And at the same time, we may not know where all to find those books. Even if we do, have the time and see, okay, like I need more in this area, where do I get them? So just think about those questions and we can discuss that once I wrap up the presentation. So what areas should we focus on? My study, it really only focused on the intersections of race, gender identity, and sexual and romantic orientation of characters in the YA LGBT collections. But more research can really be done into titles with characters of different ethnic groups, religions and cultures, national origin, especially like first and second generation immigrant stories, characters of different socioeconomic statuses, as well as characters with visual, hearing, and or speech impairments, disabilities, whether they're physical, mental, or emotional, different body types, different cosmetic conditions, by which I mean, like birthmarks, alopecia, things like that, and characters with chronic pain and chronic illness. These are all areas we should be looking into, and obviously we should be looking into these areas for like our entire collections, but I think it's especially important to have a really diverse and intersectional LGBT collection, because like I've discussed this whole time, the more representation you have, the more rounded characters you have, and the more experiences you're able to represent, the more seen those people who identify with that character are going to feel, and the more seen they're going to be by other people in the community. Because the more you see people, the more you see them as human, the more you respect them and empathize with them and are able to relate to them. And, especially given how things have been lately, I think that's especially important for us to be working on just, as a community. So really quickly for my next slide. I don't know how many of you have heard this, but I've heard stuff like this constantly. There's always somebody, on the internet or some like political pundit. Anytime anything like makes even the vaguest attempt to be more diverse and inclusive, you get somebody being like, what are they going to pander to next? A Black Muslim trans lesbian with autism? Yeah, why not? Black Muslim trans lesbians with autism exist out in the world. They deserve representation too. Those people exist. Like, it's so strange to me, but it's also indicative of like how little representation there's been, and how many of these people with all of these intersecting identities, the people complaining have been able to see and empathize with, that they can't even imagine their existence. The thing is, there is no ceiling on intersectionality. I was talking to someone recently, and there was a commercial that came on. It was like a little animated commercial. It was for car insurance or something. And it featured a gay couple. And this person was talking to me and was kind of upset about it, not because they're in any way homophobic, but they were like, you know, that just feels like pandering. And I was like, well, you know, okay, I mean, maybe it is to a certain degree, because, you know, insurance, it's a commercial, it's marketing, capitalism, yada, yada. But like, you know, what's the problem? Like, why is it like pandering instead of, you know, just representation? And the thing is anything like that you see is gonna feel like pandering, because you see so little of it. And it's not until you don't even notice it anymore that we will have really, I think, succeeded in getting past that hurdle. Because yeah, like, if it sticks out to you that much, that should be notable, not because it's sticking out to you like that, but because you see it so infrequently that it's that noticeable.
Hello.
Yes? Okay. So where do we start? Here, I'll be able to share this presentation with you guys, and all of these up here, they're links, like I that way you can go directly to them. These are just some of the resources that I've talked about in here. There's We Need Diverse Books, which is a nonprofit focused on increasing diversity in publishing, and access to reading with resources. They've got tools, they've got grants. They're an incredible resource. There's also LGBTQ Reads, which I talked about earlier, which is the blog begun by Dahlia Adler. And it features like all of these different categorized lists of LGBTQ titles. Queer Books for Teens, it's also got like all these comprehensive lists and bibliographies that were created specifically by librarians, educators, authors, and booksellers for LGBTQ titles. There's also Melinda Lowe's blog, which she hasn't done it in a couple of years, but Melinda Lowe, she's a very prolific YA author. Her blog includes years of these thoroughly detailed LGBTQ YA statistical reports, among other resources she has, because she's done diversity in YA studies, you know, for years. And these reports are incredibly interesting and also very useful. There's also Lee Wind, who has a blog titled I'm Here, I'm Queer, What the Hell Do I Read? He's got like tons of resources on queer literature for teens. And then there's YA Pride, which is a young adult LGBTQ titled master list and blog. They've got recommendations, they've got author interviews, and resources for teens specifically. And then here is some additional resources. There's the Power of Story catalog from Scholastic. That's going to give you a lot of potential titles. There's the School Library Journal Diverse Book Survey. And then they also have Diversity Auditing 101 and a Diversity and Cultural Literacy Toolkit. And as well as that, they've got Diverse Characters Impact Decisions to Buy Books. That's an article and discussion that talks about, you know, the self-censorship that I talked about earlier. And then I just thought this article would be interesting, especially if you're, you know, going to be looking into diversifying your collections, which is the shelving debate to separate or integrate. You know, do you make a lot of your LGBT titles its own section, or do you just have them all, you know, within all of your other titles? There are, you know, like potentially good, potentially bad, potentially, you know, ethically questionable reasons to do both of those things. So that's something to think about as well. All right, that's it. We can move to those discussion questions or any other questions that y'all have. But yeah, if you need anything or you have any questions, if you want the title lists that I used for my study, you can email me there at kmartin-gant@mlc.lib.ms.us, or there's my office phone number. But I'm more likely to be able to respond to email because a lot of times when I'm doing webinars, I put my phone on mute and then completely forget to turn it back on. Also, I sent Lauren an additional resource list to share with you all that has some links to, some of these resources that I've discussed in this presentation, as well as some interesting articles that are really relevant to this discussion, and just a bunch of roundups of titles from like School Library Journal and Book Riot and various other places just to kind of get you started. So that's it.
All right, Kayla, we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to scroll up and we'll go from earliest to latest.
Okay.
First of all, people asked if you could provide the list of the 150 titles that you talked about, and that may be in the resource that you provided me, and I'm about to put that in the chat as soon as we get kind of close to the end of questions.
That one's not, but I can give all of those titles to you guys.
Awesome. All right. And someone else wrote that it would be great to see the percentage of the whole YA collection in each case, I guess. So I don't know if that's available or not, but
it's like you mean the percentage of like the of what LGBT titles, how much that makes up like each actual YA collection?
I think so. Someone just asked, what is the percent of the whole YA collection in each case?
I don't unfortunately have that information. I wanted to, but because I was doing this study, kind of in the time of COVID-19, there was really no way for me to definitively get those numbers in a way that would be in any way timely. For me to be able to finish this one. It is something that I intend to discuss and address and get numbers on at some point. I'm in contact with a lot of those library systems about that already. It's just they're going to need to run their internal reports, and then we're going to have to kind of go back and forth on that. And I just wasn't able to do that at the time.
All right. Someone else asked, I'd be interested to know how centralized ordering and or lack of titles from particular warehouses might play a part.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, like midway through this discussion. Like how many, are you talking about publishers or like the actual distribution?
I'm not sure.
Either way, that would be good to know, just the correlation between the physical availability and then the availability on the publisher side. And that's one reason too why I talked about, some of these titles, they aren't necessarily marketed very well either. And all of that impacts what we see, what we order. And that, it all just trickle down in like the worst way.
So someone else asked, I'm having a hard time putting the 50% in context. How does that compare to other book lists cultivated in that way? And then they further explain, like knowing our own budget issues, there's no way our own library system could own 100% of top recommended books in any genre. How does it compare to other book lists?
I don't know that I can off the top of my head offer a comparison to, any other like actual book list. But my general like recommendation when I've discussed this with some of my my public librarians, in like team training and all of that kind of stuff is like, you absolutely don't have to have 100%, of any list, absolutely. But my point of that was even the library system that was the largest in the whole state had the biggest budget and so served the most people and had if any library was going to have the money to get more of these books, it would be that one. Still only managed to hit 50% of those title matches. And that's why I want to emphasize that's not me in any way dragging that library system or any of my library systems, because Mississippi's a poor state and our libraries are not funded very well at all. But my general recommendation for stuff like this isn't, you have to hit 100% mark. Because that's a continuously moving goalpost, because new books come out all the time. Your populations are going to change a little bit. You have a number of factors that go into your collection development. My point is to see of these areas where your biggest gaps are, and just every time you're doing ordering, maybe order one or two, like, as it doesn't all have to be at once either. Just a little bit at a time can help build up those collections. And that's why I wanted to do this study, was to see, not just who had, the biggest LGBTQIA collection, or who had the most intersectional one, just so I could, give them a first place trophy, but to see what the biggest gaps in their collections were in terms of representation, so that they could potentially address that, even if it's just a teensy tiny bit at a time.
Someone else asked, how many people at each location are authorized to order titles? Centralized ordering is often a problem situation.
Yeah, that really depends. I couldn't tell you for each system, also because especially during the pandemic, that stuff kind of changed hands depending on what all was going on. We also had a lot of turnover in our state around that time, in terms of directors and youth services people. I know at my library system, we had like centralized ordering, but the youth services departments were allowed to order, the youth services titles, or allowed to like create the order. We just, had to send it on for further approval to, our centralized like headquarters. So really, again, that just kind of depends. But if that's also the case, and, you've got to kind of pinpoint, okay, where exactly is this hurdle, and how can I address that, if at all? I'm not saying, like, if you've got a director, or, a youth services coordinator or something that's refusing to allow you to order those titles, that you need to like start a fight or anything. I'm not indicating that, but it's good to know where the issue is, so that you can hopefully address it, or find some kind of way around it, in order to get more of these books where they need to be.
All right, we have more questions. So another one is, keeping track of all of these various identities seems to come very naturally for you. Do you have any tips or advice for those out there who have a harder time keeping them all in mind?
I think I understand this question. So if I don't, like, please by all means correct me. But the thing is, for a lot of my life, I didn't. I grew up like in really, really rural Oklahoma, and then I moved here to like suburban Mississippi, and I was pretty sheltered, and it wasn't until I really made a lot of friends who weren't white, weren't cis, weren't straight, who had disabilities, and who had a lot of intersecting identities, that like I was able to have conversations with them and just kind of hang out and absorb some of that I started to really pay attention to that. And so like I don't know I don't know like how exactly my process was necessarily for going about that. It's kind of something that once it got brought to my attention, it made a lot of sense. And then it's kind of, like one of those things where when you see something for the first time, you kind of start to see it everywhere. And so I started to notice just how many people had all of these different, identities, and how they interacted and intersected with one another. That it was something that really kind of stuck out to me. So my best, like off the top of my head, advice for that is to honestly go on the internet and do some reading. The internet is often a completely horrifying place. I will give you that. But the internet is also magical in that it allowed me and a lot of other people who grew up like me, the first opportunity I ever got to really interact with people who have completely different walks of life from me. And there are, think pieces and essays and blogs and YouTube channels and stuff that are dedicated to these kind of topics and examining them and, discussing what they mean. And, if you email me like if you've got like any more specific like questions about that, you can email me and I'll see like what I can find you to kind of get you started. But truly, like the internet to me is a gift in that regard, because it really diversified my pool of people that I knew existed, and it gave them a platform and a voice with which to express all of that in a way that I never would have seen, just growing up in where I grew up.
All right. Another question is, I know a lot of systems have a formal vendor process to pick who and where to buy books. So do you have any thoughts on how to advocate to a system to add a small press where a lot of these titles may be coming from?
I'm actually in the process of discussing that with a coworker right now. The state data coordinator, his name is Mac Bunton, and he's one of my coworkers, and we are working on this. We're both the co-chairs of the Mississippi Library Association Social Justice Roundtable, and in the meantime, until we can find sort of like convincing avenues with which to get systems on board with being able to order from some of these small presses. One thing we're trying to work on doing is maybe providing some of these titles to libraries, us getting them ourselves. Because like that is a huge issue. Like when I was in my old public library system, we had to order through Baker and Taylor. We could maybe do an order through, another small press like occasionally, but we had to jump through hoops in order to do it. So I understand that is a problem. And while I don't necessarily have any talking points I can give you right this second, again, you can email me about that, because that's something that Mac and I are literally working on, and like we've been talking about, in the last couple of days, actually.
I think that is all for questions, but we do have some really awesome comments that for sure, everyone, I'd love for you to read through them. I have dropped the extra resources in the chat as well, so you'll have please be sure to click on that before you leave today. The staff at Harnett County Public Library wrote that a note for identity stuff like that, a good faith effort is better than no effort. So I think that was important. Trying to scroll through here to see. Someone else suggested check out VLA Graphic Novel Diversity Awards. Mm-hmm. Just scrolling here, everyone loved David, the Schitt's Creek.
My husband and I are watching that for like the first time. We've been slowly watching it, stretching it out, and savoring it. And I mean, I'm pretty sure our neighbors hate us because we've been screaming laughing like every episode at least once. So I had to include him.
That's been everyone's pandemic show, I think.
Yes.
Another person wrote, I also think it's important to have these titles really visible so that they can be easily found by those looking for them. They said they've had teens hesitant to ask for help.
Yes, and one thing I will say about that is having them visible, like that's kind of a double-edged sword. So my general advice is to do both. Obviously you don't necessarily want to put, some kind of label on it, because we generally don't, we try not to do that, at least, in my state, that's, kind of a thing that we address. You don't want to necessarily label it, but here's the thing, like this is another thing that is something that like library Twitter as a whole kind of talks about, and a lot of YA authors and publishers talk about, is you need books that are visibly queer, that kids can find easily, and that people more than anything can see and know, that that's in your collection. It's there for a reason. If nothing else, just having those books there and visible kind of provides a sort of very like subtle welcome mat. But also you want other titles that aren't visibly queer and don't necessarily have a lot of that identifying information on the covers and on the book jackets, because you have a lot of kids that want to read these books, but the guardians or authority figures in their life don't want them reading these books. And you want them to be able to read the books that they want to read and see the representation they want to see. Even if that sounds like so sneaky and underhanded, but I know y'all understand what I mean. Like, sometimes you need to go the subtle route so that kids can get what they need.
All right. We do have one more comment. Becky shared, in my experience, putting labels on them makes them easy to find for challenges, but we do need to make sure that we're giving those titles the same space and consideration in things like displays, staff pick selections, RA materials, etc.
Yeah, and like also just on that note, you don't only have to do, like throw all your queer books out there in June. That's also part of the intersecting identity element. And there's a link in one of the resource lists that I provided that's like talking about like not just queer pain and struggle, but queer joy. And there's also like a whole list of queer rom-coms with happy endings. Like you can diversify not just your collections but your displays all year round, and make those titles available, and not just during it's kind of like how you need to have titles that have Black main characters especially visible on the covers, not just during February. So yeah, like it's I had a thought and then it left. I'm so sorry. But yes, I agree.